I work with Public Finance Public Accountability Collective, and I'm based out of Delhi. Basically, when we talk about the union budget, now union budget in itself is an extremely complicated document. It's got a lot of technicalities. So speaking about the gist of it in a matter of 15 to 20 minutes, I have tried my level best not to use many technicality and stick on to the theme that was given to me by Siddharth, which talks about what are the general facets of the union budget of 2022-23 and a general trend that is noticeable when we talk about budget and natural resources based communities. So before getting into the budget per se, we also need to talk about what's the macroeconomic trend in general, or as a broad category. How do we see the macroeconomic trend in the country? Now that we know for the last 2+ years, we are all in the midst of this pandemic, and our economy has indeed been slowing down. So what exactly are the impacts that we have faced or we are going to face? And was it only because of the pandemic that we have come to this state of our macroeconomy, or kind of shaky even before the pandemic started? So to have a broad idea of what exactly are the macroeconomic indicators, let's just take a stock of what our macroeconomy looks like. And one way of doing that is, how do we approach it? So I'll try and approach the macroeconomy in a backward direction. So let's start from what we are right now at the present and go back to a time which is just before the pandemic hit. That's before 2020. Now, when the budget was presented this year, Nirmala Sitharaman, our finance minister, she said that India is on its path to grow 9.2% in terms of real GDP over the last fiscal year. Now, a fiscal year in India is basically seen between 1st of April to the next year's 31st of March. So she said that we are going to grow by 9.2% in the last fiscal as compared to the fiscal year before that. Now, you all must have read, heard, seen stories that India's economy was actually sinking and it crashed by almost 24%. Now, if that was the case, that India's growth was crashing by 24%, and the very next year we say that, okay, we are now growing by 9.2%, does that mean that India's economy is absolutely fine and it's growing robustly? Well, no, because when you consider 24% in the negative domain, and then now you consider 9.2 in the positive domain, the cumulative effect of India's growth story amounts to just over 1%. Now, when I say just over 1%, that is the growth that we are going to witness most probably now as compared to when the pandemic was not present. So when we talk about when the pandemic had not yet hit, we are talking about the fiscal year 2019-2020. Now, compared with that, when we look at 2021-22, our growth rate is just about 1%. So it clearly means that our economy is not as strong as it has been claimed to be. Now, there are a host of issues. Like I said, is it because of the pandemic that our economy has started to slide, or were there issues even before the pandemic? One thing is agreed upon is like once the pandemic struck, our problems with the economy only started to get multiplied, which also means that before the pandemic struck, our economy and its fundamentals were not very strong. And the reasons could be attributed to, if we go back to 2016 November, when the Prime Minister announced demonetization, that was a first shock to this economy. Thereafter, in July, when the GST got introduced, that was a second shock to the economy. So these two shocks combined had already shaken the very fundamentals of our economy. On top of that, the pandemic introduced or pandemic induced lockdowns. We've had almost 3 lockdowns, one of which was a nationwide lockdown, has only exacerbated the way our economy has been sliding. But apart from that, there were certain macroeconomic fundamentals in India which were already in a pretty bad shape, which are, we have probably the highest level of unemployment or underemployment in the last 4 decades now. Our unemployment rate has actually been soaring in a pretty exponential manner, which also means that since there are so many or underemployed people in the country, there is hardly any opportunity for creating job. And when there is no job created, that will never act as a lubricant for economy to move on smoothly. So that's one major issue. Second issue is rising inflation. Like today only I was reading that our inflation, now when we talk about inflation, there are two kinds of inflation we talk about. One of them is consumer based and one of them is wholesale based. Now our wholesale inflation is something like 13% and our consumer inflation is something like 6%, which means that our normal day-to-day goods and services that we engage with, that we buy, that we sell, that we transact, are going to get costlier. And you would also know that over the last 2 days, the petrol prices have started to rise again. Yesterday, I think it rose by 90 paise per diesel, per liter for petrol and for diesel. Today, it was 80 paise. Even the cylinder costs have gone up by 50 rupees. So which means that, the prices of our normal day-to-day commodities is rising, or they are going to rise. Third, crumbling social infrastructure. Now, we have seen this in plenty. We have read about this. We have talked about this. Like when the pandemic was at its peak, specifically the second wave of the pandemic, we know how our healthcare facilities simply melted down. They just did not have the capacity to kind of look at the positive cases, to care for them, to treat them, so much so that they even couldn't provide them with the basic facilities like oxygen, bed, ventilators, or for that matter, even medicines. So, health becomes a part of our social infrastructure. So it really had undergone a massive shock. The second problem, the third issue was social infrastructure, of which health is a major component. Education is a major component. Now we know that for the last 2 years or so, schools were not functioning, colleges were not functioning. And if we look at, the rural population, why even go to the rural population? Even in urban centers, school education or college education really suffered massively in this last 2 years. So we do not really have the necessary infrastructure to provide education. Then we have food insecurity, which also is, under a lot of stress. Then there's gender disparity, like the number of women who were, employed earlier, that's really gone down. And the opportunities going for employment for women has also not really risen. They're also going down. And if at all there is some sort of an employment, it's only in the informal sector. So even that's kind of crashing. And then we obviously have the issues of climate crisis. How do we deal with that? I'm sure you as a community are much better aware about the challenges that you face there. And last but not the least is the income inequality. Now, when we talk about income inequality, we also say that some corporations have really profited wonderfully well in these last 2.5 years during the pandemic, but the number of people who were on the margins of poverty now are below poverty line. So there's an income gap that is getting very evident. Economists all over the country, they call it as a K-shaped recovery, if at all there is a recovery. So these are the issues that we have been facing with the macroeconomy. When we talk about budget, there are 3 points now. The first one is budget. When was it? Now, this is a pun, basically. We all know that the budget was presented on the 1st of February this year. But when I say when was this budget, it's basically, if you look into the documents, the official documents of the budget, you will see that this time the budget was anything but a budget, because there was hardly any monetary provisions made. There were hardly any clarifications on the figures that kind of added up to its revenue or that added up to its expenditures. So unlike the previous years, when these figures, these data and statistics were easily available on the budget, on the website, this time it was very difficult to locate these figures, these statistics, the data that was absolutely just not there. It was kind of hiding in between tall promises and major claims and proclamations. So that's the reason why I'm saying, when we say when was the budget, it's like we did not find anything like a budget in this particular year or in this year's budget speech. The second is something that now we are all now talking about, is Amrit Kal. Now, Amrit Kal basically means like we are entering into that particular era of independent India, when India would be at 100 years of its independence. So from now on till 2047, the intervening period is known as Amrit Kal. Now, Amrit Kal is what this budget really focused upon, which means that for the next 25 years is what this budget focused on, or what it projected into. Now, this is a very common understanding of any economic student also, even in the graduate level, that a budget is only prepared with next 1 year in mind. It is never prepared for such a longish time as 25 years. And even if it is done, so you need to substantiate and back it up with certain objective figures and statistics. So all of this was missing, but what really came out as the big headline of this budget was that we have entered the Amrit Kal. So, this kind of also put a question mark about how serious was the budget that got presented this year. And third, let's now look at what is India at 75 years and what is India at 100 years of independence. Now, when we say India at 75 years of independence, 2022 is that time when India completes 75 years of its independence. Now, if you remember, when Modi first came and became Prime Minister in 2014, he made certain tall claims. The first claim was that the per capita income of every Indian would be raised from $1,900 per year to $3,000 per year by 2022-23, which is the present fiscal. What is the reality? The reality is that we are stuck at $1,258. That is our per capita income in 21-22. That means we have not even reached 1900, and we were promised that we would reach 3000. That was supposed to happen at 75 years. So we are far away from that target, achieving that target. Second important thing, India at 75, the claim was made in 2018 budget speech that the employment level of women in the country would be raised by 30% by 2022-23. What's the reality? We are seeing that in the midst of the pandemic, when unemployment is at an all-time high, 23% of the 3.5 crore people who are unemployed are women. So we are again nowhere near the target. Third important thing, we talk about GDP. You remember there was this meme that was going around, we will be a 5 trillion economy, and somebody is asking a BJP spokesperson, how many zeros are there in a trillion? We were supposed to be a 5 trillion economy by 24-25. But before that, another milestone was set, that is this particular fiscal year, when we were supposed to be a 4 trillion economy. The reality is, if we look at the size of our economy, it is something like 2.5 trillion as of now. That means, again, we are way short of the target that we had aimed for at India at 75. So what is really happening here is the goalposts are now getting shifted. They're getting shifted ahead in time so that something about the non-attainment of the targets is now kind of conveniently pushed forward in time through this budget. That's why when I say that this particular budget was anything like a budget that we had seen previously, these points, they go on to substantiate these and these claims. There was a mention of Amritkal in this budget, and there was also a mention of how do we achieve the targets set during the Amritkal. So there were 4 major priorities that the finance minister laid a lot of emphasis upon. First is PM Gati Shakti. Now, PM Gati Shakti is something that is extremely close to what the challenges the fish workers in the country, be it the fish workers by the coast or inland fish workers, are going to face, because PM Gati Shakti talks only about massive investment in infrastructure. Now, this infrastructure would have rail connectivity, road connectivity, port building. Then it will also have interlinking of rivers. It will see to it that rivers become much better navigable. So basically the emphasis is on an infrastructural pipeline which goes by the name of PM Gati Shakti. For instance, there's a plan to have 25,000 kilometers of road network in this particular fiscal year. The second aspect is inclusive development. Now, stress is laid on those aspects of development which have not really percolated to the last mile connectivity. So how is it possible to kind of bridge this gulf is what inclusive development is talking about. Again, I would like to stress here that there is no proper data on this, and this goes for a 25-year vision as it is in Amritkal. Third is productivity enhancement. Now, productivity enhancement can actually range from how do we increase productivity by digitizing services to how can we increase productivity by switching from capture fisheries to culture fisheries. So even this particular aspect is considered under productivity enhancement. And last is financing of investments. Now we know that there is a slowdown in investments in India. So how do we overcome that? The idea is, let's start with public investment to begin with. Once that gets started, call in, invite private investments. Private investment will come and take over what has been built out of public investment, and this will then turn into a circle. So the private will kind of then withdraw, public investment will come, and then again private will come. So the idea is to create an ecosystem of investment that goes cyclically from public to private to public investment. So these are the four major priorities. I will kind of come to this particular slide a little bit later. But since the topic of this particular talk happens to be natural resources based communities, so I'll kind of subtract a lot of other sectors here and focus on some of these which are absolutely essential for us. The first one is education. Now, what really has happened is we are seeing that in 2022-23, that is this year's budget, an absolute amount as far as allocation was concerned has been increased. Fantastic. But if we see that particular allocation as a percentage of GDP, then it has not increased, it's actually gone down. So even if the absolute numbers have increased, the percentage share has gone down, which means that is government really serious about education as a proper social infrastructure? We do not know. Health, something similar happens here. Health, the absolute allocation has gone up. That could be because of the 2.5 years of the pandemic, and still the vaccination, and we are still not out of the pandemic completely. So it was expected that the absolute allocation would rise, and it has. But on the other hand, health as a part of GDP has shrunk, has gone down, which again means that a very crucial sector of social infrastructure has not been really emphasized in this budget. Now, the third one is rural development. Here, the story is the reverse. Our rural development allocation has gone down. The best example of rural development would be the Manrega scheme. The Manrega scheme has actually been slashed by close to 26%. So, which is a drastic fall from what it was last year. Now, this is really surprising because when the first national level lockdown happened, we have seen visuals of the migrant labor walking all the way to their hometowns, which meant that there was a vacuum of industrial economic activity that got created in the urban centers. And these people who were going back to their towns, were adding some sort of an economic burden in the rural sectors. So what was expected was when the reverse migration happens, that is when these migrant laborers start going back to urban centers on work. So to facilitate that reverse migration, allocations should have increased, or even to, have job creations in the rural pockets, allocations by way of Manrega should have increased. But a 26% of a fall is absolutely shocking, more than surprising. This is what we are seeing now. Now, the fourth important sector, and that's absolutely essential for us here, is agriculture. Until a few years ago, agriculture also encompassed the Department of Fisheries. But now I think the Department of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry and Dairying, they have separated, but they are still considered to be allied sectors to the agriculture sector as such. Now, if we look at the agriculture sector, we will see that there's only a 2% increase in this year's budget allocation. Now, this is again quite surprising because we have seen a lot of unrest that was being caused by the farmers' agitation for the last 1 year. We have also seen that there was inflation, so the prices were going up. So all these factors, when we consider, it should have obviously been quite commonsensical to see that allocations for agriculture would have been much more than 2%. Plus, when the whole of the economy was not doing well, agriculture was the only sector that was showing some positive growth. So why such a bias towards this sector? Now, when we talk about fisheries and animal husbandry and dairying, now we are seeing a 40% rise this year, which is like, to be exact in figures, it's like almost 1900 crores have been allocated for this particular ministry. Now, out of the 1900 crores, 73% alone has been given for fisheries sector. What is the idea behind that? I think, Sebastian or Edwin and Siddharth would be knowing that better, but my understanding is that the governmental agenda is to see that the switch from capture to culture happens much more smooth, alongside considering or designating fish workers as agricultural labor. When that happens, certain schemes and policies of the government could then be extended towards fish workers, because now they are designated as agrarian farmers or agrarian laborers. So this is my understanding, but I'm sure you would have much deeper insight into it.
Sorry, Himanshu, I'm just going to interrupt also. We're about 35 minutes into your presentation. So we just need to perhaps try and wind up so that the other speakers also.
Just give me 2 more minutes and I'll be done.
Yeah.
Then another aspect of the natural resources that we talk about is the renewable sector, the renewable energy. And yes, there is a significant increase in allocations towards that. And that also goes on to show that India is at least trying to sound loyal to the pledge it made at the Glasgow Climate Summit late last year. And at the same time, there's a corresponding decrease in the allocations that we are seeing in the fossil fuels like coal. Reliance on coal has actually gone down as far as budgetary inputs are concerned. And last but not the least, about the populations on the margins. And, I have put question marks here because what we haven't really seen is how those who have been socially or economically marginalized, or the minorities in the country, how have they really got benefited from the budget of this year is absolutely not clear. And even if there has been some figures that we could decipher, we are seeing that there is a decline in allocations as regards these margins or marginalized populations are concerned. I'll skip these 2 slides. Maybe we can have it when we are having a discussion. Last slide is like, how do we kind of then go about it? First thing is, I think government needs to refocus back its energy and its resources on Manrega, because right now we've had a major immigration of the migrant labor force from urban centers to rural pockets, and to have them occupied with employment opportunities there, much better allocations are required. And I'm sure there's going to be an increase in the revised estimates that we might see later. There should be an equivalent of a Manrega for the urban sector, so that there is an urban employment guarantee scheme that the center comes out with. And we at least create some sort of a social safety net for the unemployed or the underemployed in the urban centers. We definitely need to improve our social infrastructure. That includes health, that includes education facilities, drinking water, sanitation. All these things, they need to be improved. And unless government kind of refocuses its energy back on the sector, like something like a COVID or a fourth wave of COVID can once again, kind of puncture us. And last but not the least, like these are just two instances I would like to draw the attention to. The center's focus on resettlement and rehabilitation idea when populations get displaced because of big projects coming there is a lack of implementation capability, and that needs to be enforceable. It needs to be enforced at the highest possible legal authority that we can think of. And for example, forest workers, because in Bengal, when we talk about the Sundarbans, they are also forest workers, they're also fish workers. So would that be a problem if they are finally designated as farmers, so that the benefits of the agricultural ministry or agricultural sector gets extended to fish workers or even the traditional forest dwelling populations? Thank you so much.